Movies have given us a pretty clear picture of medieval cities. What you've probably seen is a world of unrelenting, grimy chaos. Cobblestone streets, if you can call them that, are more like rivers of mud and filth. Every few seconds, a window opens overhead and someone yells "Gardeloo" before dumping the contents of a chamber pot right onto the street, maybe onto the head of some unlucky passerby. The entire city is basically one giant, open-air landfill. Smelling of rot and disease, it's a powerful image. It's also more of a caricature than an accurate portrait. The real story of how medieval cities dealt with their trash is far more complex and frankly more interesting. It wasn't a modern, sanitized system with garbage trucks and recycling bins, not by a long shot. But it also wasn't total anarchy. It was a constant, messy, and evolving struggle. They had rules, they had specialized jobs, and they had a surprisingly keen awareness of the problems their own waste was creating. This wasn't a society that was just content to live in its own filth. Rather than accepting it, they were constantly trying to manage it. So today, we're going to dig into the muck and find out how a medieval city, from London to Paris, actually handled its trash problem. First, we need to start at the source, the medieval household. Forget plastic packaging and Amazon boxes. The trash produced by a single family was almost entirely organic. You had food scraps, vegetable peelings, bones from a meal, stale bread. You had ash and cinders from the hearth, which was burning constantly for cooking and heat. You had broken pottery, worn-out leather shoes, and textiles that were patched and repatched until they were little more than rags. So what did you do with this daily accumulation of stuff? Well, for many, the solution was right in their own backyard. Most townhouses, even in a crowded city like London, had a small yard or garden space behind them. In this space, families would dig a simple pit. This was the household midden. It was basically a combination of a compost pile and a personal landfill. All the organic waste from the kitchen went in there. The ash from the fireplace was particularly useful as it helped to reduce the smell and could improve the soil. Over time, this material would decompose and create a rich soil that could then be used to fertilize the small kitchen garden where they grew herbs and vegetables. It was a closed-loop system in a way. Archaeologists love these pits. When they excavate medieval sites, these rubbish pits are like treasure troves. They find seeds from the fruits and vegetables people were eating, bones from the animals they consumed, broken bits of pottery that tell us about their daily life. It gives us a snapshot of the household economy. But the pit wasn't a perfect solution. It could attract rats and other vermin, and if your neighbor's privy was too close to your well, you had a serious problem with contamination. So while the private midden was the first line of defense, it was only part of the story. The real challenge began when that waste left the private property and entered the public space of the street. This is where the classic image of filth really takes hold. And yes, medieval streets could be disgusting. The main problem was that the very concept of public versus private responsibility was still being hammered out. In the early medieval period, it was largely a free-for-all. People threw their waste out the front door because it was the easiest thing to do. The street was seen as a kind of no man's land. But as towns grew more crowded and trade became more important, civic leaders realized this couldn't continue. A street blocked with dung and refuse wasn't just unsanitary, it was bad for business. So cities started enacting laws. These were some of the earliest forms of urban regulation. In London, by the 13th and 14th centuries, a whole web of rules was in place. It became illegal to just chuck your rubbish into the street. You couldn't throw water, clean or dirty, out of your window without shouting a warning. And if you did, you were liable for any damage. The responsibility for the street was pushed onto the residents. You were legally required to keep the section of the street directly in front of your house clean. If you didn't, you could be fined. These weren't empty threats. We have court records from London where people were brought before the authorities for obstructing the King's Highway with a pile of dung, or for letting their pigs wander and make a mess. For example, in 1357, a man named Thomas at Tehran was fined because he had a dung heap in front of his tenement that was a nuisance to all passers-by. This tells us two things. First, people were absolutely breaking the rules. But second, there were rules, and there was an authority trying to enforce them. The enforcement was inconsistent, of course. What was enforced in a major center like London was probably ignored in a smaller market town. And even in London, the system was always under strain. But the key takeaway is that medieval city dwellers weren't oblivious. They understood that a clean street was better than a dirty one. The conflict was between that civic ideal and individual convenience. It was a battle between what was good for everyone and what was easiest for someone. Rather than a sign of ignorance, the constant stream of new laws and fines shows they were actively and persistently trying to solve the problem. Now we need to talk about the smelliest problem of all, human waste. Where did it all go? The chamber pot is iconic for a reason. In many households, this was the primary toilet. But what happened after it was full? The garde-lou image of tossing it from the window did happen, but it was increasingly frowned upon and in many places illegal. Doing so was a sure way to start a feud with your neighbors. The more common and responsible method was to carry the pot outside to a designated place. For those with a bit more means, the solution was the privy or a latrine. This could be a simple wooden shack in the backyard built over a cesspit. This pit was basically just a deep hole lined with wood, stone, or wicker designed to contain the waste. It was a step up from the chamber pot, but it created a new problem. Eventually, the cesspit would get full. And emptying, it was one of the most disgusting, yet essential jobs in the entire medieval city. This job fell to a specialist known as a gong farmer or nightman. The name gong came from an Old English word for to go or to walk, but it also became a euphemism for a privy or dung. These men worked only at night, for obvious reasons. A team of gong farmers would arrive after dark with buckets, ropes, and a cart. Their job was to climb down into the cesspit, shovel the semi-liquid filth, known as night soil, into buckets, haul it up, and load it onto their cart. It was incredibly hazardous work. The fumes could be toxic and overpowering. Cave-ins were a real danger. Because of the foul nature of their work, gong farmers were often social outcasts, forced to live in specific areas and paid very well for the risk and stigma. So where did all this night soil go? It didn't just get dumped in the river, at least not always. This stuff was valuable. It was a potent fertilizer. The gong farmers would cart their haul out of the city to designated dumps or sell it directly to farmers in the surrounding countryside. This created another fascinating medieval industry, the trade in human excrement. It was the ultimate form of recycling. The nutrients from the city's food were returned to the fields to grow the next harvest. Public latrines also existed, especially in larger cities. London had several, most famously the one built on London Bridge, which had seats for both men and women and emptied directly into the River Thames below. It was a practical solution, if not an environmentally friendly one. The system was a mix of private responsibility and specialized public service, all designed to keep the city from literally drowning in its own sewage. So we've covered household trash and human waste, but what about the general grime of the streets themselves? Even if every citizen diligently swept their own storefront, the streets were full of other sources of muck. The biggest culprit was animals. Medieval streets were packed with horses, oxen, sheep, and cattle being driven to market. All of these animals were producing a tremendous amount of dung. Add to that the mud that was churned up by cart wheels and the general litter dropped by thousands of people. The street was a constantly regenerating mess. This is where another set of civic workers comes in, the rakers. These were the official street cleaners of the medieval city, the closest thing they had to a sanitation department. Their job was straightforward. They were employed by the city or a specific ward to go through the streets with rakes, brooms, and shovels, and collect all the filth into a horse-drawn cart. They were literally raking the muck. This wasn't a volunteer position, it was a paid municipal job. In 14th century London, the city was divided into wards, and each ward was responsible for hiring its own rakers and ensuring the streets were cleaned. The cost was often paid for by a special tax or scavenge fee levied on the citizens. Once the raker's cart was full, they couldn't just dump it anywhere. They had to transport it to specific, officially designated locations outside the city walls. These were the great muck heaps, sometimes called lay stalls or dunghills. These were massive, sprawling piles of urban waste. They contained everything from street sweepings and animal dung to household refuse that people paid the rakers to cart away. They must have been an incredible sight and smell. These heaps were a problem, but also a resource. Just like the night soil from the gong farmers, the material in these muck heaps was a rich compost. Farmers and gardeners would come and buy cartloads of it to fertilize their fields. So in a way, the city was exporting its waste back to the countryside that fed it. This system of rakers and lay stalls shows a significant level of organization. It demonstrates that medieval authorities understood the scale of the problem and were trying to create a centralized, systematic solution rather than just leaving it to individual households. It was a constant, uphill battle, but it was a battle they were actively fighting. Of course, the rakers didn't work alone. They had a whole army of unpaid, four-legged assistants. Animals were an absolutely integral part of the medieval sanitation system. We tend to think of medieval cities as being just for people, but they were teeming with animals, and many of them were there specifically to eat the trash. The most important of these were the pigs. Many households kept a pig. It was a walking garbage disposal unit and a future source of bacon. Pigs would be let out into the streets to forage for food, and they would eat just about anything: vegetable scraps, dropped food, even human and animal excrement. They were incredibly efficient at cleaning up organic waste. The problem was that pigs were also a nuisance. They were destructive, they could be aggressive, and they produced their own waste. City authorities were in a constant struggle over pigs. They would pass laws forbidding people from letting their pigs roam free, and then people would ignore the laws because a free-ranging pig was a self-feeding pig. Then the city would hire official pig catchers to round up strays. It was a classic medieval dilemma. The pigs were both a solution and a problem. Besides pigs, you had packs of dogs of uncertain ownership that scavenged for scraps, and then there were the birds. In cities like London, the red kite was a protected species. These birds of prey were incredibly common, and their primary food source was carrion and refuse from the city streets. They were so effective as scavengers that killing a kite was a serious offense. They were like a feathered cleanup crew, soaring over the city and swooping down to pick up dead rats or discarded bits of meat. This entire urban ecosystem of pigs, dogs, and kites was a vital, if chaotic, layer of the city's waste management. It was nature's way of dealing with the problem, operating in parallel with the human systems of rakers and gong farmers. It highlights how medieval people saw their cities not as separate from nature, but deeply intertwined with it. Not all trash was created equal, however. A pile of horse manure or some vegetable peelings was one thing. The waste from certain industries was another thing entirely. These were the big polluters of the medieval world, and their trash posed a much more serious challenge. The butchers were a prime example. A single butcher slaughtering animals for the market would produce a torrent of waste: blood, entrails, bones, hides, and unusable bits of fat. This stuff was foul, and there was a lot of it. In the early days, they would just dump it in the street or into the nearest river. The area around the butcher's shambles was notoriously disgusting. The blood would run in the gutters, and the stench of rotting offal would hang in the air. Similarly, tanners, who turned animal hides into leather, were major polluters. The process involved using substances like animal dung, urine, and caustic lime. It produced horrible smells and a toxic liquid effluent. Dyers, who colored cloth, would dump used dyes full of chemicals into the water. Blacksmiths produced coal dust and slag. These industrial wastes were far more noxious and harder to deal with than simple household garbage. City authorities recognized this. They knew these trades were essential for the economy, but they also knew they were a public nuisance. So they began to use zoning as a tool of pollution control. This was a fairly sophisticated concept for the time. They would pass ordinances that restricted the most polluting trades to specific areas of the city. For example, butchers might be required to operate only in a designated street, and they were often forced to be downstream and downwind from the main population centers. In London, many of the smelliest trades, like tanning, were eventually pushed outside the city walls entirely, to the suburbs where their pollution would affect fewer people. They also passed laws about how these trades could dispose of their waste. Butchers were told they had to carry their blood and offal out of the city at night, rather than just dumping it in the Thames. We have records of butchers being fined for trying to secretly pipe their waste directly into the river. This constant regulation shows a clear understanding that industrial waste was a special category of problem that required a special kind of solution. It was an early form of environmental regulation, born out of the necessity of making a crowded city livable. Ultimately, for a lot of waste, the final destination was a waterway. Rivers and streams were the arteries of a medieval city, bringing in goods and providing water, but they were also its primary sewers. Many cities were built on rivers for this very reason. The flowing water was seen as a God-given, self-cleaning drain. Gutters on the side of the street were often designed to channel rainwater and whatever else was in the street towards the nearest stream or ditch, which in turn fed into the main river. In London, the classic example of this was the River Fleet. Originally a clear, fish-filled tributary of the Thames, it was gradually turned into a notorious open sewer. The butchers' shambles, tanneries, and public latrines all drained into it. by the 14th century. It was described as being so clogged with filth and refuse that the water could barely move. The stench was legendary. People complained about it constantly. They petitioned the king to do something, and occasionally efforts were made. They would organize massive dredging operations to try and clear the channel, but it was a losing battle. The sheer volume of waste being poured into it was more than the river could handle. The pollution of the Thames itself became a major concern. This was, after all, the city's main source of drinking water for many people. The conflict was obvious. You couldn't use the river as both your primary water source and your primary dump without serious consequences. People got sick. They knew the water was foul. This led to one of the great medieval public works projects, the creation of conduits. Starting in the 13th century, the City of London began to build an elaborate system of lead pipes to bring fresh, clean spring water from sources outside the city into public fountains or conduits within the walls. These conduits were a huge source of civic pride. They were often ornate structures where people could come and collect clean water for drinking and cooking for free. It was an explicit acknowledgement that the river water was no longer safe. It shows that medieval people not only recognized the problem of water pollution, but they were capable of organizing and funding a massive, long-term engineering project to solve it. It was a separation of clean water in from dirty water out, a concept that is absolutely fundamental to modern sanitation. So when we look at the whole picture, what do we see? The myth of the medieval city as a place of complete and utter squalor, where people were happily wallowing in filth, just doesn't hold up. The reality was a constant, difficult negotiation. It was a society developing the very ideas of public health and civic responsibility from the ground up. They didn't have germ theory, but they knew on a very practical level that filth caused bad smells and that bad smells seemed to be linked with disease. They called it miasma or bad air, and they spent a surprising amount of time, money, and effort trying to clean their air and their streets. They created a multi-layered system. It started with the individual household and their private rubbish pit. It expanded to include laws and fines governing the cleanliness of the public streets. It created specialized and sometimes high-paying jobs like the gong farmer and the city raker. It relied on an informal ecosystem of pigs and kites to consume organic waste, and it involved sophisticated urban planning, like zoning polluting industries away from population centers and building massive aqueduct systems to bring in clean water. Was the system perfect? Absolutely not. It was messy, it was smelly, it was often overwhelmed. Laws were broken, officials were corrupt, and the technology was limited. A 14th-century Londoner transported to a modern city would be amazed by the cleanliness, the lack of smell, the sheer miracle of underground sewers and weekly garbage collection. But they wouldn't be amazed by the concept of waste management itself, because they had one too. It was a system born of necessity, managed by trial and error and constantly evolving. Rather than a chaotic free-for-all, it was a complex human response to a problem that every city in every era has had to face: what to do with the stuff we leave behind. The medieval approach was more organized, more thoughtful, and far more human than the simple, dirty caricature often lets on.